Hello, my name's Simon, and this is a talk about stupidity and why thinking about stupidity is an important issue for managing language teaching organisations. Now, in this talk, I'm not really going to talk about what I believe is right or wrong or true or false. This is really about encouraging us to see things from a different point of view. And in this talk, I'll be using an approach which is usually called sense making. And sense making is the idea where maybe as an individual, but probably even better as a group, we try to work out new perspectives when we're thinking about our workplaces. And one of the reasons why we need new perspectives is because there are sometimes things that happen within our workplaces that we maybe ignore or we forget about, or maybe in some cases we even deliberately hide. So that's sometimes why it's really useful to take a common concept that maybe we think everybody already understands and look at it from a different way. And this time, that's why I'm talking about stupidity, because probably we all already think we know what stupidity is. Now, in this talk, I'm going to ask some questions. Maybe I can even answer some of them, but I'm going to put the questions up on the screen. If you feel the need to think about them for longer, then feel free to pause the video while you are considering them. Also, as this video is being recorded for IATEFL, and I'll be available live as you watch it to be able to answer any questions, then please feel free to ask a question in the chat section of the conference website. Okay, so back to stupidity. Most of us, I'm guessing you, are either a teacher or maybe a manager or at least involved in running a language teaching organisation. And if that's the case, then generally we could say that most of us, we are in the knowledge business, whether that's the knowledge that we have in terms of our ability to do our jobs, or maybe be the fact because knowledge is why our students, our customers, come to us in the first place. It's all about knowledge. So if that's a starting point, then we probably would assume that maybe an idea like stupidity must be a bad thing. We want to avoid stupidity at all costs, it probably seems. But in this talk, I want to talk about the fact that it's maybe not as easy as that stupidity can be seen in both a positive and a negative way. And to start, I'd like us to think about what we already consider when we think of the word stupidity. So very quickly, as a kind of a warmer activity, I'd like you to think about what you think about when I say stupidity. It could be synonyms, it could be antonyms, it could be expressions, it could be translations. It's up to you. So what does stupidity mean to you? Okay, so let's look at some of these. Here are some of my examples, and you can see that they're from English and from Hungarian and Thai and Chinese. And let's start with ignorance, okay? Because to be ignorant simply can mean we don't know things. Perhaps we could say from a teaching point of view, ignorance can be a good thing in the sense that the fact that people don't know things, don't have skills, means they come to us and ask us to help them to gain those things. That's one aspect. Also, we can say, you probably heard the expression, ignorance is bliss. Well, maybe we could say that ignorance has its uses. One possible use of ignorance is the fact that it can motivate us because of aspects that are unknown. So I'm sure that all of us at some point or another have had an experience where we didn't know how difficult something was going to be, and that's why we started to try to do it. If we had known, maybe we would have never have tried. So there is a motivating aspect to ignorance. Also, when we're trying to do things, the world can be a complex, complicated place. And often ignorance of certain aspects of things allows us to keep things simple. We can also think of an idea that some people would call strategic ignorance, which is has been used to describe organizations, where sometimes it's quite useful that if we are ignorant of certain aspects of what's going on in an organization, we can avoid responsibility, we can avoid blame. That might not seem like a very nice thing, but it's a common thing. And also, I suppose we could say that in a way, ignorance is the foundation of all Western philosophy, in the sense that we need to acknowledge that we are starting from a position of ignorance, and that maybe if we assume that we have knowledge that maybe we don't have, we're going to get ourselves into some kind of trouble. Okay, so coming back to this word stupidity. Well, I suppose one thing I'd definitely want to say is I don't know any stupid people. Maybe you don't either. But I've never known a person who was always stupid. But I do know, and from my own experience as well, that I do lots of seemingly stupid things, and I see stupid things around me all the time. What are these things, right? Well, these are the things that maybe we can put together with words like careless or thoughtless, for example. So if we use examples like say on TV, like Mr. Bean, right? So what is it that makes Mr. Bean stupid? Is very often he doesn't think through the consequences of his actions, okay? Now, I don't really know anybody like Mr. Bean either, but very often when I'm watching the news, for example, I see something happens, maybe like an accident, and maybe you, like me, will say, how could that have happened? And often this is because of a momentary lapse of concentration where somebody is thoughtless or careless. And at least in one way, this is a kind of stupidity where we see even the smartest people can do stupid things. Okay, so by this stage, you're maybe saying, Simon, I already know what words like thoughtlessness and ignorance mean. Well, let's move on to the main idea, which is the idea of stupidity. And the stupidity I really want to talk about today is something that occurs in all of our organizations and affects us no matter how smart we think we are. The idea is called functional stupidity, and the basic idea comes from this book by Matt Alberson and Andre Spicer. And functional stupidity is the idea that stupidity is a thing that actually allows our organizations to function. It allows our organizations to work in both good and bad ways. And next, coming up on the screen now, I'm going to introduce some of the really key ideas from this book about functional stupidity. Okay, so according to the stupidity paradox, there are three interconnected ideas about functional stupidity. The first one is described as a lack of reflexivity, which is basically that we're not thinking about our assumptions about the way things are. The second one is about the idea that we're not asking questions about why we are doing something. And then the third one is the idea that we're not considering maybe the consequences or the wider meaning of our actions, of why we're doing something. Now, that probably requires a little bit more detail. So I'll go back to them one by one. So as I said, the first one is a a lack of reflexivity. Now, this might be a new word for some people. So reflexivity is closely connected to the idea of reflection, which is something most teachers know about. But very often what happens is maybe in terms of reflection, we're thinking about things that happened in the past. Maybe, if we're lucky, we're thinking about what we're doing right now. But reflexivity has a added element where we're thinking about our assumptions, questioning our assumptions, and thinking maybe also about what we should do about this. Well, it's an focus on the future kind of orientation as well. So if we think about, say, our organizations, there are always going to be beliefs, practices, values within every workplace where we just accept them as normal, right? It's just the way that we do things. And we may notice that it doesn't seem quite right, but maybe we don't do anything about it. And when we kind of notice things that are wrong, we're noticing things that maybe just seem incorrect or maybe inappropriate or inefficient, and sometimes even things that are morally wrong. So the second one is about this idea of asking why. Well, this is related to the first one, but slightly different in the sense that this is about asking other people to justify their decisions that affect me. So when somebody asks me to do something, am I saying to them, why are you asking me to do this? Now, there are lots of reasons why we don't ask questions when we probably should. And I suppose one of the first ones is the idea of authority. Maybe sometimes it's just the boss is telling you to do it, so you do it. So authority is one issue. Another one is the idea of convention, where basically people just say, oh, we've always done it that way. Let's just carry on doing it. I don't need to ask any questions about it, right? The third one is also the idea that can be described as taboo. Now, probably taboo means, I don't know, maybe in a shocking way. But taboo can also just mean that this is the way that maybe our profession or our organization has done this. And we're just not, that this, it's surprising to us that we might think about doing something in a different way. So there's the third one, again, connected to the others, is about the idea of kind of refusing to see the big picture, making sure that we only see things in a narrow way. It's connected to those ideas where maybe people have said, keep your head down, or play the game, or don't rock the boat, those kind of ideas, right? And very often, I think this is a very important kind of aspect that we see in teaching organizations, that idea of having a very narrow focus. When maybe we obsess about teaching techniques, for example, where one thing becomes fashionable and other things get forgotten about. Maybe we're focusing on specific curricular requirements. We might be focused on very, very specific criteria, when really we should also be thinking about kind of how they relate to each other, and also maybe we're just not seeing a big picture, often because it maybe just seems too difficult or maybe even too controversial. So, overall, I hope you can see that functional stupidity is not ignorance. Instead, we are deliberately not using our intelligence. We're deliberately not reflecting on our situation, and we're not asking questions, and we're not thinking about the consequences of our actions, even though we are capable of doing it. And we may even be totally aware that we are not using our capacities to the maximum. So the next question really is, why are we functionally stupid in our organizations? So to examine the question, we need to think about maybe why is it that smart people, and I'm assuming that most teachers are smart people, why is it that they do these things where they don't maximize their potential? As I don't have much time, I'm simply going to list 5 possible reasons why people are functionally stupid. And the first one is the idea of leadership. So leading can require authority. So let's think of an example of a traditional view of a military chain of command where the officer tells the soldier to do something and doesn't expect there to be any questions about it. Although, of course, actually in the modern military, the chain of command doesn't really work that way at all anymore. But also you could take an old-fashioned traditional view of a school where there is a headmaster who gives the rules to all of the teachers in terms of what they're expected to do. And in that case, of course, the idea of functional stupidity seems pretty obvious. However, in modern organisations, the relationship between leadership and employees is much more complicated. And leadership can be seen as inspirational, it can be transformational, it can be distributed, it can be democratic. We even have humble leadership nowadays. And so all of these ideas seem to make the idea of leadership much more worker-friendly than it used to be. So maybe we don't need to have the old top-down relationship between a boss and employee anymore. Our management structures seem a lot flatter. However, that doesn't actually always seem to be the case. And what seems to happen is that the functional stupidity is now just more complex and sometimes a little bit more difficult to see. A second source of functional stupidity is the idea of organizational structure. So all organizations have rules and routines and procedures. They are necessary. They're intended to make our working lives better, more efficient, maybe even more pleasant. They reduce the possibility of mistakes, even disasters. They can keep everything running smoothly. But for many different reasons, organizations can become too dependent on these structures and systems. And over time, the structures that prevent problems can also begin to create problems. And quite often, even though we are noticing that something seems to be going wrong with the system, we still don't ask questions about why it's going wrong and what we can do about it. And that's another example of functional stupidity. A third idea is the idea of imitation. So lots of management specialists talk about best practice, and organizations spend a lot of time borrowing ideas from each other. Sometimes this can work really well, especially in the short term, but it can also lead to functional stupidity. Often the ideas that we borrow are implemented in a hurry, or maybe implemented carelessly, or maybe we don't fully understand what was intended originally. In some cases, we imitate the industry leaders because competition means that every organization needs to have the most fashionable or latest development to keep current in the marketplace. This could be a new virtual learning environment, or it could be a high-tech aid to teaching. For example, if you're as old as I am, you probably remember what happened when interactive whiteboards were first introduced into many schools around the world. It was often a disaster. Okay, so it could be a change in our values. So, for example, environmental sustainability or diversity programs. All of these things are good in themselves, but if our organization isn't really capable of introducing or sustaining those effectively, it can have the negative effect. Often these good ideas become simply window dressing, and actually they become another source of functional stupidity. So I'm going to talk about the fourth and the fifth ideas together, and the fourth idea is the idea of branding. So I guess, I work for a private language organization, and so I've kind of got used to the idea of branding over the years. Even if you work for a public state-run school or organization, you're probably already familiar with the idea that even their branding has become more important in recent years. And I guess in the technological age we live in, we've also got used to the idea of personal, individual brand as being important. A long time ago, brand would have been about what colour the writing on a chocolate wrapper was, but it's much more for us than that now. So, of course, branding is the idea of important part of communicating with our students, with our customers or whatever, right? But also, of course, branding is used internally and it transmits messages inside an organisation, which in turn leads to the fifth idea of organisational culture. Organisational culture is a big issue. We don't really have time for much about it now, but really the idea is that every organisation is going to have values and systems and images and all these kind of things. We're all familiar with them, which it's hoped as employees, as members of the organisation, we're going to buy in to those things. We're going to kind of take them seriously. And I suppose over time what happens is we begin to internalize some of these things, which is why Alberson and Spicer talk about the idea that organizational culture could be seen as a compass in terms of the idea that it can give us a direction of what we're going to do as members of an organization. But at the same time, it can also be seen as a prison, right? Because culture of any kind can also restrict our freedoms to move. And we probably are all aware how sometimes if we're part of an organization, we kind of unconsciously maybe become part of the organization, that we become part of the culture and the culture becomes part of us. But also by becoming part of that organization, it can sometimes blind us to the weaknesses of that organization and maybe to other things that are going on around us, because we buy in to the shared beliefs of the organizational culture. So this brings us back to a point I mentioned earlier, which is how can this idea of functional stupidity be seen as a good thing, a positive way of helping us manage our organizations? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the three big ideas of functional stupidity are not being reflected, not reflecting on what we're doing. They are not asking questions, probably when we should, and they're not seeing the bigger picture, even when we can. These seem like bad things, don't they? So how can we see them in a positive way to allow our organization to work more smoothly? So how can the idea of functional stupidity be a good thing both for us as individuals and for the organization? Well, one example is maybe decision making. If you've ever read the books by Michael Fullan, nearly all of his work is based on the idea that for educationalists, for teachers and teacher managers, making good decisions is the heart of what it is that we do. But decisions can be very difficult. One of the benefits of functional stupidity can be that it can remove layers of complexity and remove uncertainty sometimes when we are making decisions, so that we don't need to reflect or justify too much. We can just go ahead with doing what we've been trained to do in terms of making our decisions. Often that means that the decisions that are made go more smoothly, maybe they're not questioned as much, and life just seems easier. This can also be related to the idea of what we call cognitive biases. People are becoming more familiar with this now. So we all know that kind of left to our own devices, people can do some pretty strange and irrational things. And sometimes the idea of having systems that we can describe as that make us functionally stupid reduce our ability to be irrational because we're following a system. Okay. Another idea could be the idea that functional stupidity, buying into organizational culture in a big way, it can help us feel more secure and happy in our workplaces, because we can be part of a team that's pulling together, and maybe we have this sense that our team is a great team, maybe better than the competition. Okay. all of these things mean that we know that it doesn't matter how smart you are, the feeling, the emotional feedback that you get from this is very powerful. It's sometimes worth it. It's worth more than our individual sense of autonomy or our individual pride. So to Alberson and Spicer, this means that a skilled, sensitive manager knows that they've got to be able to develop skills as both a stupidity and anti-stupidity manager. These skills where we have to think about the balance between the appropriate amount of individual creativity and intelligence that will allow our organizations to innovate, whilst at the same time also keeping a kind of the whole organization focused, moving together, doing whatever its core business is. And so kind of to give this a kind of equation, I'm going to show these on the screen right now. So one way of looking at this is to see that we could say the more smartness we have in our organizations, maybe the less functionality they will have, because people can be pulling in different directions because of their individual interests and intelligence. However, when we have more functionality trying to keep the organization together, this may also require more collective stupidity. Another way to see this could be to think about the idea that the more smartness we have in our organizations, then the more this is likely to lead to some kind of disorder, where maybe individual people are pulling in different directions. And so, conversely, the more functional stupidity we have in the organization, then the more order we have, because it's all coming together. Now, maybe for some people who are familiar with this idea already, this sounds quite closely connected to David Snowden's idea of IATEFL. Okay, you've got a link later on in the video to help you find out more about this if you don't know. But this is another one of these sense-making tools. And it's basically about the idea of being aware of and constantly balancing the idea of order and a lack of order in an organization. And as I've said all the way through this video, this isn't where order is a default good thing and unorder is a default bad thing. I think Nevin discusses the idea that in the same way that smartness and functional stupidity need to be balanced in a organization that's working successfully, order and unorder also need to be balanced. That's probably something to think about for a different time. So unfortunately, I've run out of time today, and I can't talk about all of the other things that I would like to connect with this idea. But the key point is this idea of functional stupidity. And you might remember right from the beginning, so functional stupidity isn't just the same as ignorance. Functional stupidity is the idea that for many different reasons, we don't reflect, we are not reflexive, even though we could be. We don't ask questions about why we are asked to do things, maybe even when we can or maybe we should. And also that sometimes there are reasons why we focus on something rather narrowly when it would also be maybe in our best interests to ask big picture questions. Why? Well, because there are both positive and negative aspects for our organizations. And that's the takeaway, if I can suggest one, for this talk today. Okay, so functional stupidity is a great way of making sense of our organizations. So it doesn't matter whether you are a teacher, an employee within an organization, or whether maybe you're a manager or a leader of an organization. Look at what's happening. Think about your own organization and see where the stupidity is. Is it being managed? Is it being encouraged? Is it being downplayed, because if we get it right, we can make our organizations nicer, more comfortable, more focused places. But if we get it wrong, we can alienate and demotivate ourselves and our colleagues. So thanks very much for watching this today. And if you've got any more questions, then I'd be delighted to ask them. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.